Welcome, guys, to another episode of Parvez Trade. And the last video for today, I want to talk about China, Xi Jinping, and what the future looks like over there. And look, I know there's been a lot of talks recently about what China has been doing, the rise of China. There's been so many videos that has been made on this topic, how China wants to invade Taiwan, how they're modernizing the military to make sure they win the war if they fight a war against Taiwan and all that. But I'm here to give a more, I'll just reality-based perspective on what's going on. So first thing let's understand is that China has the current state of China is that Xi Jinping wants to move his economy from low-end manufacturing to high-end manufacturing. Okay, he realized that China's GDP has reached, its economy has reached a point where if it wants to grow its wealth any further, they need to basically move China's manufacturing activity to the higher end stuff like semiconductors, automobiles, and he's upskilling his population for that, right? And then you come to the Chinese military. People talk about how basically you have China modernizing its military because it wants to fight Taiwan. And I honestly think that Xi Jinping doesn't necessarily wants to fight a military war to gain Taiwan. He definitely wants Taiwan to be part of China. Okay. So just to give you guys a quick history recap, basically, after the Second World War, the Chiang Kai-shek, the military general that was in the military government that was ruling China, they lost to the communists, and then the military government fled to Taiwan and set up a alternative Chinese government in Taiwan. And basically, after the Second World War, for a long period of time until President Nixon, you had the Taiwanese Republican government of China, which was recognized in UN and most of the world as the only Chinese government. So you had hundreds of millions of people in mainland China, and they were not even recognized by most of the world. Okay. But the Taiwanese government in Taiwan, the Chinese government in Taiwan, which was ruling over a few million people, they were recognized as the representative for China. And this happened until the 1970s when Nixon established relationships with Mao. So for a solid 30 years' time, mainland China was not even recognized as China, even though the communists were now in power and then won the Civil War. So, I mean, think about how that history impacts a guy like Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is a guy, he was sent during the political revolution and all that. Mao Zedong punished Xi Jinping's father and sent Xi Jinping to work on the agricultural lands in the countryside. And when he was living in the countryside, Xi Jinping had a bunch of books that he would read all night, every night. Okay, while living in a cave. So I'm trying to understand this person when you try to understand the current China. This is a guy who's been extremely curious about education, about knowledge, about gaining knowledge, about receiving, being intellectual, theoretical to some extent. So this is not a guy who's extremely glued to reality and pragmatism. Okay, he's someone who has higher sophisticated philosophical thought process. And so he understands when Xi Jinping talks about the 2049 goal of revitalization of China, right? He wants that will be the 100th ceremony of anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party in China. And so when he talks about the revitalization of China, He basically wants to bring China back to its old days of glory before the British Opium Wars and before British Britain and UK took over Hong Kong and all that. And part of that revitalization goal is to take over China, well, Taiwan, and connect it to the mainland. And an intellectual guy, a sophisticated guy like Xi Jinping, understands very well that if you can bring Taiwan into your sphere of influence by peaceful means, that will be more sustainable than trying to bring Taiwan into your sphere using military. And look, this simple way to think about this is yes, on the one hand, China can try to overpower Taiwan's military, take over militarily by force. On the other hand, the Western collapse, economic collapse is coming. Okay, this is pretty obvious. It's going to happen any day now. And when the Western countries collapse, Taiwan will have nowhere else to go but to reunify with China. Right? The only reason Taiwan can now boast about its independence and all that is because they have the backing of the Western powers. And it's actually something similar to the end of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet government went bankrupt, you had all these loyal Eastern European countries, so-called Eastern European Soviet states, that decided to join the European Union and NATO. And the reason they joined European Union is not because most of them were extreme fan of Western Europe, but because joining European Union means receiving financial assistance from the fast-growing economies of Western Europe. And in a similar aspect, if the Western countries' financial collapse takes place, then Taiwan will have no choice but to basically align themselves with China. And in that scenario, Xi Jinping does not need to use the military to take over Taiwan. And that scenario leads to a more sustainable uh, way to bring Taiwan into China's sphere of influence. So yeah, Xi Jinping, scenario one, they can take over Taiwan by military force. Scenario two, they can try to influence Taiwan's politics to bring a more pro-China leadership into Taiwan government. But then there's scenario three, where Xi Jinping basically has to bide his time and, if possible, accelerate the decline of Western financial influence. And then Taiwan will have no other choice but to join China. So yeah, I think people needs to really understand this, that it's not a one-trick pony. There are multiple ways to skin a cat. And yeah, I think Xi Jinping is betting on the third one because recently, if you look at the recent transactions by Chinese state government, state banks, they've been basically shorting US dollar. And the way you short US dollar is basically you make sure you basically, well, I mean, there are different ways to do it, but in simple terms, if you give USA money and they have to pay it back to you, you're basically shorting US dollar, if that makes sense. So very good example is like what happens when you short a stock? You borrow the shares, right? And then you sell it in the open market. And then hopefully when the shares value go down in the future, you buy back the shares at a low price and you make the profit. So you borrow shares, sell it in the open market, share prices goes down, you buy back the shares at a lower price, and you profit the difference. And you have shorted the stock in the process. Similarly, if you want to short in the forex market, you borrow the dollars, you sell it in the open market, and you buy back the dollars at a later phase. And what that looks like is Chinese state banks gives money to US government, and then later the US government has to return the money as repayment of the debt, and they'll have to return the money in US dollars. So when the Chinese state bank is giving loan to US banks, they're basically selling the dollar, right? Like Chinese state banks are converting yuan to dollar and loaning it to the US banks. In the process, they're selling the dollars. And because it's a loan, later on, these banks will have to return the money to China. And now China is buying back those dollars. And because US dollar is depreciating in value over time, the actual value of the dollar that they sell to the US banks is higher than the value of the dollar they get back or buy back when those US banks repay the loan. So that's China State Bank has been shorting the US dollar in that way in the last 1 year. They've provided that through that mechanism alone, they've provided few $1 billion of loans. And now a lot of people confuse that with buying bonds, right? When you buy US bonds, that's the same thing, right? And it is to some extent when China is buying US bond, they're basically shorting US dollar because they're giving loan and then they're going to get a return on the loan later on. Look, recently, Middle East in Saudi Arabia, they held the largest, I believe, US Treasury bond auction. So buyers and sellers got together to buy and sell US Treasury bonds. Okay. Guess who was the biggest player in that auction? This happened this year, by the way. You can search it up. Saudi Arabia, US Treasury bond auction. Guess who was the biggest player during that auction? It was China. Because they're sitting on this big pile of US bond and debt. So, yeah, they're basically shorting the US dollar by all mechanisms possible. And the more money they give out to USA through these loans, the faster, the more the short position is, more downward pressure there is on US dollar. And this is basically what Trump is trying to avoid. This is why he's trying to balance the federal budget because he understands what China is doing. He understands China can only do this because the US federal government has been running a deficit, and you only need to borrow new money when you run a deficit. That's why Trump is trying to tariff, which is a form of taxation on American citizens, and because he wants to balance the federal budget because of this. And yeah, so that's what's been going on. Now the question is, can actually Trump balance the budget? Look, I made previous videos about this. I don't think he can. He can definitely reduce the deficit, reduce the borrowing volume, and reduce China's short position on US dollar in the process, right? And yeah, I think, look, here's what people need to understand. Where does most of US government's federal revenue comes from? Okay. It comes from income tax. So over 50% of US's federal government revenue comes from income tax. Okay. And US current unemployment rate is around 3%. So when Trump talks about increasing the manufacturing jobs inside USA by tariffing imports, where's the labor force? This is why I'm telling you that this tariff bluster, even Trump, I think, knows very well. You can, there's about a few million Americans that work for the federal government. Even if you fire all of them, that's not going to be enough people for the labor base that's required to supplement most of the American imports with locally made products, right? Unless you want to increase immigration. I don't think he wants to do that. Or maybe he does. He just doesn't want to tell his people because increasing immigration means increasing income tax, means balancing the budget easier, makes that easier. So yeah, I just wanted to give you guys an idea about when the mainstream media talks about China's military, Taiwan invasion, and all that, just understand that Taiwan is much more sophisticated because they have the financial resources to go after the US dollar, unlike Russia. Russia had to choose the path of war because they don't have the financial means to short the US dollar. China does. China owns $1 trillion in US bonds. Okay. And yeah, now the problem comes to if American leadership, American government decides to sanction China, block all this, sanction, freeze all these bonds that China owns. And that's where you have these auctions. For example, this recent auction in Saudi, China sold a lot of US bonds because they're basically trying to minimize those risks. When they buy US bonds and basically give US government money, I'm talking about China, they're basically shorting the US dollar in the process, like I explained. But they're very well aware that US leadership can now hold that over their head. They can come up with fake excuses to freeze those bonds, freeze those bank accounts, sanction China for whatever reason. So China is deleveraging from that by selling those bonds to the big bond buyers like Saudi Arabia. Okay? And yeah, so now the question comes down to why does Saudi Arabia wants to buy those US bonds? Because Saudi Arabia is going to be dependent on American military protection for a long time to come. And yes, Saudi Arabia, you cannot freeze the US dollar bank accounts because the Saudi Arabia cannot then pay for US's military protection in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, it's the complete circle of life basically. And now the question is, why doesn't Riyadh want to switch to China's military sphere of influence and Russia's. Look, the truth of the matter is this. You can buy the most expensive equipment your money can buy. As Saudi, you can do that, no doubt. But you have to understand your army does not is not the strength of your army is not made up with a bunch of expensive. It's not composed of how expensive your military equipments are, right? And so yeah, Saudi Arabia the is the biggest buyer of American military equipment by far. But the reason they can't exert military influence around Middle East and everywhere else is because their army is not that strong. Okay? Just having expensive military equipment does not make us more strong army. You know, I mean, look at Taliban, look at Afghanistan. They didn't have the most sophisticated equipments. They drove out the Americans. They basically taught the Americans to a grinding halt. They tired the Americans out, and yeah, they were more determined than the Americans. And so they didn't need sophisticated military equipments. They had an iron mind, a strong determination. And I think Saudi Arabia knows very well that their army is not that hardcore yet in terms of the military personnel that works in Saudi military. And you cannot expect them to be. Okay, they grew up in an oil-rich country with a lot of subsidies, a lot of government facilities. They didn't grow up in a hard neighborhood like the Taliban did in Afghanistan. So no matter how much you strengthen them, they're not going to be as strong as the Talibans are, who grew up in very poverty-stricken environments, right? And now the question comes to what does the future of Saudi Arabia looks like, right? Well, I mean, you have a country like Iran that has their own military, that has a strong military, and they're determined. And I talked about this in a previous video. The problem, not the problem, but the advantage, I would say, of theocratic regimes like Iran is that they're willing to fight till the end. Okay? They're willing to fight till the last man because it's their belief that keeps them going. It's not some, claims or whatever. And yeah, it's just, I think, look, you cannot have economic sovereignty unless you have military sovereignty. Okay. And if you want to be economically independent as a country, you need to have your own military to be able to protect that country. Look at Canada right now. Trump is tariffing the church, as out of them. There's very little Canada can do because they're not militarily independent. That's just the truth. Okay. Canada is not militarily independent. And so they have to listen to Trump's tariffs. It's not because Canada is dependent on USA for trade and economic purposes. I mean, yeah, that's true, but Canada can try to trade with other countries in Asia and even why not trade with Russia? I mean, Canada does not have a beef with Russia, right? And increase trade with Europe. But any naval trade, you need a strong military to be able to protect your trading route. And USA is not going to spend its military power protecting Canadian Navy ships while they're tariffing Canada's trade. Not under Trump, at least they won't. So yeah, it's an interesting. I just think when people think about global influence, rise of empires, and they think about wars and military, but I think you can easily conquer. The famous saying, you can conquer a country using the sword or using debt. China has decided they want to use debt, and they might use that to take over Taiwan, and they might not use the sword. That's my 2 cents on that. So yeah, have a good night. I'll come back with another video soon.